We're going to continue with biodiversity and look at more specific functions of species within their ecosystem. Each species has a specific ecological role called its niche. There are 4 important roles that a species can play within an ecosystem, and they include being a keystone species, a native species, an indicator species, or a foundation species. I will also take some time to talk about non-native species, as these definitely have an impact within an ecosystem. A keystone species is usually a small number of species that have a substantial effect on the variety and number of other species within their ecosystem. So for example, the alligator, the shark, the leopard, and the lion. More specifically, the American alligator is considered a keystone species because it digs holes that hold fresh water during droughts, and their nesting mounds serve as nesting sites for birds and turtles. This keystone species affects the type and abundance of other species in the ecosystem. Other keystone species can be responsible for the pollination of flowers, such as butterflies and honeybees, regulation of the population of other species, like the alligator or the wolf. They may cause population crashes and extinction of dependent species if they themselves are drawn to low population numbers. A native species is one that lives and thrives in a specific ecosystem. A non-native species, or what we call exotic or alien species, has immigrated into the ecosystem and was deliberately or accidentally introduced into that ecosystem. These non-native species can threaten native species through competition for resources and reduce the number of native species. They can also spread rapidly within a particular niche and outcompete other species, and they may not even have predators to help curtail their numbers. The non-native species, as I mentioned, can be called exotic or alien species. These can be beneficial, but more times they're harmful. An introduced species typically doesn't have predators, parasites, and/or grazers. An example of this is in 1957, the wild African bee was imported to Brazil to help increase honey production. These bees have actually displaced domestic honeybees and reduced the honey supply. The nickname for the African bee is the killer bee. It has now moved as far northward as Arizona in the United States. It's killed about 150 people in Mexico since 1986. And these bees continue to migrate northward at approximately 150 miles per year. Another example of a non-native species is the water hyacinth in Florida. In the late 1800s, the water hyacinth was introduced in Florida by a private homeowner. Originally from South America, this beautiful flowering plant grows on the surface of the water. The plant spread quickly throughout Florida and throughout the southern United States. It has a remarkable reproduction rate of over 600,000 plants per year. It crowds out the native plants and makes river navigation impossible. This plant inhabits over 2 million acres in the southern United States, and over $11 million has been spent in Texas, Florida, and Louisiana alone trying to deal with this plant. Other examples of non-native species include Japanese beetles, fire ants, gypsy moths, zebra mussels, kudzu, and purple loosestrife. We'll talk more about some of these species later on in this lecture series. An indicator species is sensitive to changes in the ecosystem. It provides early warnings of the community and ecosystem is being damaged somehow. An example of this is the decline of migratory insect-eating songbirds in North America. This decline is being attributed to habitat loss from urbanization. Amphibians are also good indicator species. We've actually experienced extinction of different amphibians in Central and South America, tropical rainforest, and research biologists have attributed that extinction to small changes in temperature resulting from climate change. These indicator species provide an early warning system for us, and they can fall into any category of fish, birds, butterflies, and amphibians. Foundation species. Foundation species are known to create habitats and ecosystems such as the beaver, the elephant, and species that are seed dispersers or pollinators. Of the 4 important roles that species can play in an ecosystem, the 3 that I think are the most important are the keystone species, the indicator species, and the foundation species. A term that I'd like you to be familiar with is trophic cascade. Basically, any series of events, directly or indirectly related to the removal of a species, is important to the whole function of the ecosystem. Sometimes, once a species is removed, the balance cannot be restored, and therefore you have a cascading effect to other species within that ecosystem. Okay, so let's look at the example of trophic cascade in relation to the removal of a top carnivore in an ecosystem. In 1926, a keystone species, the wolf, was annihilated from western United States, in particular Yellowstone National Park. In 1944, Aldo Leopold, a conservationist, forester, philosopher, educator, writer, environmental activist, journalist, campaigned for the preservation of wildlife and wilderness areas. He felt that wolves were important, and the loss of the wolf from the ecosystem was going to have a ripple effect onto other species as well. In 1973, the Endangered Species Act was passed, and I'll talk more about this law later in this short video lecture series. But as part of it, the passage of this law, they put the wolf on the protection list, despite that it was no longer existent here in the western United States. Research biologists saw that there was an impact on the ecosystem as a result of the wolf being absent, and these 2 pictures depict a before and after scenario. With the wolf as part of the ecosystem as a keystone species, you have a mix of large and small predators, you have a very diverse plant community, a diverse songbird community, and fewer large herbivores. In other words, elk and mule deer and bison, which feed on the vegetation. After the wolf was removed from the Yellowstone National Park ecosystem and some time elapsed, you ended up seeing large predators being absent and small predators dominating, like the coyote and the fox. The result was that you had numerous large herbivores because their predators weren't feeding on them. So you had an increase in elk population, mule deer population, as well as bison population. These herbivores fed largely on the vegetation along streams and decreased the amount of vegetation and resulted in a simplified plant community. With the simplified plant community, the result is a lower songbird diversity as well, and the beaver population was impacted here in addition to that because without the willows along the streams, because they were eaten by the moose and the elk and the mule deer, the beaver weren't present because they rely on the willows. I have a link down here to the Trophic Cascade video, and I have placed this video in your D2L course shell for you to view, and it discusses the wolf impact on the ecosystem within Yellowstone National Park. So if you haven't done so already, please make sure you take time to watch that short video clip. So let's talk about another keystone species, the American alligator. The American alligator was a top predator at the top of the food chain and helped control numbers of rodents and other animals that might overtax the marshland vegetation. It's considered a keystone species in wetland ecosystems, and it was almost hunted to extinction in the 1950s. As a result, it was placed on the endangered species list. People thought that this was a unique reptile that would never recover due to the devastation of the numbers of alligators in the region. In 1987, it was pronounced fully recovered and actually has been removed from the Endangered Species Act protection list. So let's look at some details to this. The greatest value that the American alligator has in the wetland areas is the gator holes that they create. These gator holes basically are caused by the alligator using its mouth and claws to uproot vegetation to clear out a space for them to lay in the water. Then they shove with their body and slash around with their tail to wallow out a depression that basically stays full of water in the wet season and holds water after the rain stops and series of drought may occur. During dry season and drought, the gator hole still provides water for fish, insects, crustaceans, snakes, turtles, birds, and other animals. This is a picture of a gator hole on the far left of your screen. And even during drought and dry seasons, this will still be filled with water, which provides a purposeful water source for other species. Here's a picture of the American alligator, and this is a graphic showing the increase in population of alligators over time until it was delisted from the Endangered Species Act in 1987, and we're starting to see a population decline again. So the populations are still being tracked. Part of the reason we're seeing this population decline occur is because of habitat loss as well as overconsumption by humans, because you can hunt and kill alligators for food purposes. The story of the American alligator is definitely an important success story, and that's because there was such a drastic decline of this species and a complete recovery as well. It's also a story of federal government and state government cooperating with one another to put protective measures in place for this species. And it's definitely a prominent success of the nation's endangered species program. Let's talk about generalist and specialist species. Generalist species have broad niches. They can live in a wide range of environments, and they are much less prone to extinction. And I've provided some pictures for you on the right with the American cockroach, the raccoons, and the white-tailed deer. Other generalist species could include like the crow, the cardinal, blue jay, rats, etc. Specialist species have very narrow niches, and they live in only a few types of habitats and are more prone to extinction because of their inability to tolerate environmental change. Examples of specialist species include the river otter, the pileated woodpecker, the koala, the panda, and the scarlet tanager. Niche requirements for survival and reproduction are, how much water is available, how much sunlight does a species need, how much space does it require, what does it feed on, what feeds on it, what are the temperatures in that area? What's the humidity? And what are the other environmental conditions that that particular species can or cannot tolerate? So the question then comes up, is it better to be a generalist or a specialist species? This graphic depicts the resource use availability and the number of individuals for a specialist species, the panda, and a generalist species, the raccoon. Generalist species have wide niche and generally have higher populations and can live in a variety of environments. Specialist species have a very narrow niche based on the resources available and can live in a specialized environment. Specialist species are more prone to becoming endangered. For example, the spotted owl requires old-growth forest in the Pacific Northwest for food and shelter. The koala lives in a limited habitat in Australia which feeds on only eucalyptus leaves. The tiger salamander only breeds in fishless ponds, also known as vernal pools, which are not connected to any stream or other river or surface water body that could contain fish. And the pileated woodpecker is a bird that favors mature forests with heavy wooded parts. They prefer large mature hardwood trees and are only found in large tracts of forests. So there's some real specifics that are needed for our specialist species to live and thrive. This graphic depicts geographic isolation, which can lead to reproductive isolation. Geographic isolation refers when groups of the same population become physically isolated, maybe because of mountains or rivers or distance from one another over time. Reproductive isolation occurs when a mutation and change by natural selection operates independently in the gene pool of the geographically isolated population. Speciation occurs when one species splits into two or more different species, and those species are considered different when individuals can no longer breed and reproduce fertile offspring. The example presented here is the Arctic fox in the north and the gray fox in the southern United States.